You're listening to Parasearch UK Radio. News, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch UK Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised.
You're listening to The Spirit Dimension with your host, Kerry Greenaway, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Bent double, like old beggars under sacks. Knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of disappointed shells that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him, drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
Good evening and welcome to The Spirit Dimension. My name is Kerry Greenaway and tonight we have something a little sombre and a little different for you. I'm joined in the studio by a lovely co-host. You know her well. She's an absolute authority on this subject. I would just
crumbs.
say a lot more than me anyway. Welcome, Penny. Welcome, Penny G. Morgan.
Hello, my lovely. Hello. Yes, it is a very sombre subject we're going to be talking about, but it's one I think needs to be talked about on a regular basis so that people don't forget.
I totally agree with you. We are, of course, talking about World War I in particular tonight.
Yeah.
Today marks the 100th year anniversary of World War I going silent, basically, at the 11th of the 11th, 1918. Silence fell on the guns, basically, and the shelling, and it marked a very poignant point in history. So tonight we want to have a look at that. The poem you've just listened to was read out by Christopher Eccleston. Thank you very much, Christopher. And
shout out to Christopher Eccleston.
Hell yeah. Like I know him well. And it was called Dulce et Decorum Est, which was written by a very famous poet, a World War I poet, Wilfred Owen. Now, Wilfred's story in itself is actually quite poignant because while he was, while he was in the trenches, he wasn't well known as a poet. He was very unknown. It was only post-death, really, that he became famous for his work. And he actually died on the front line 1 week before the end of the World War, wasn't it?
It was, yeah. He was part of a group that were trying to cross the Sambre-Oise, I think it's pronounced, canal, almost exactly 1 week to the hour before the end of the war. And he has there's a lot of famous names associated with him. He was very good friends with Siegfried Sassoon, who's another very famous World War One poet. But yes, the fact that he died a week before the end of the war, almost to the hour, I think is very poignant and very. It shouldn't be that because his name is famous, it makes it more almost heart-wrenching. But it does, in a way.
Yeah, it kind of does, I think. Particularly as his work in particular. I don't know about you, but it was one of the poets I actually studied when I was doing English literature at school.
Ah, right. No, I didn't. I've never studied the war poets. It's as a hobby. It was probably about 10 years ago. And I started reading some of the poems by the war poets. So people like Sassoon, Rupert Brooke, who's another famous one. Who else was I reading? I can't even speak now myself. Rudyard Kipling, people like that. And my parents had gone to the trenches as a holiday, not a holiday, but because that's where I get my history thing from.
Yeah. And
they brought me back some World War One books of World War One poetry, and one of them is the War Poets, an anthology. And that's when I started reading it. Obviously, I knew a lot of them just from sort of general knowledge. I knew the opening lines. And my favourite one by Wilfred Owen, probably because of its poignancy, is one called Anthem for Doomed Youth. Because he was only 25 when he died.
Yeah.
He was a baby. And I mean, the opening lines. Can I read the opening lines of this poem? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine, honey.
What passing bells for those who die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty horizons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mounting save the choirs, the shrill demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. I just find that.
It just gets you. I have to say, when I read poetry or stuff like this, it gets me every single time.
Yep.
And I just would like to say that Dulce et coram est actually means it is sweet and honourable to die for one's country. And I can't think of, yes, I think people should stand up for their freedom, and I'm not degenerating, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean, putting down anybody that does. But the way that war in particular went on was absolutely horrific. I just want to, we're not going to go into the politics tonight of it. We are going to look at some of the spookier side of World War One, because there were some incredibly interesting tales that have come out about experiences
very much
through the war. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but I just want to give a couple of facts and figures really on this one. And I would just like to say, before I give you these facts and figures, they were very changeable across different sites. So these are not definitive figures, everybody, but this is just some of the figures that came out. It changed a lot. So basically, World War One began on July the 28th in 1914. It lasted 4 years, 3 months and 14 days. In total, and this is total, not just Britain, this is total people of all sides, 65 million soldiers were mobilised. 8 million soldiers died and 21 million soldiers were injured. Out of that, there were 250,000 underage soldiers, the youngest being 12 years old. His name was Sidney Lewis. How incredible when you look at the figures.
Yep. It's something that, I mean, it was actually, I shared something on Facebook that Richard Estep, had sent me, and it showed a small part of where the Battle of the Somme was, and the numbers of bodies they'd recovered from each. I can't remember the parameters that were used, but I shared it to the Parasearch page as well, and it showed the number of bodies on each one, and I showed it to my husband because he's very interested in this sort of history as well, and we mapped out the area that they were collating we mapped it out to see what, and the sheer density of bodies, and the fact that there's still bodies being found now, 100 years on. But one of the things I do want to say about that, I'm glad you looked at the total number, because a lot of people I find only focus on, if they're British, they focus on the British side, or if they're German, they're expected to focus on the German side. As far as I'm concerned, everyone went through the same thing, whatever trench you were in. The only innocents, in my opinion, the true innocents, were the animals that were used. You know, I do tend to, when I look at wars, be they First World War, Second World War, American Civil War, whichever one it is, everyone was equal. They just happened to wear different uniforms. And one of the things you were mentioning, the casualty figures and stuff, I looked into some of the main battles that people have heard of. So you've got the Battle of the Marne, which is one of the big ones, Gallipoli, which was where is known as the Anzacs Battle as well, and was actually where the guy who ended up being known as Ataturk, and that's why the Ottoman Empire was renamed Turkey, was after him. But the one that actually stunned me was actually the Battle of, I don't know if I can pronounce it right, Brusilov, which was in June to September of 1916. And that was a predominantly Russian battle. Now, the Russians were kind of one of our allies during World War One, and nearly 2.5 million Russians were casualties in that battle.
I mean, it's incredible, the figures, isn't it?
You just can't comprehend it, can you?
No, you can't. And I have to say, no war is good. It's not pretty. War is not pretty.
No.
And it is a fight for survival, and following base instincts and orders, and just doing what you can to get through minute per minute. And it must be terrifying. Yep. Particularly,
I would.
I have to say, in the World War One, when you look back, and this is the reason we need to never ever forget, so we don't recreate history, because it's just horrific. Now, anyway, there have been some very, very interesting stories that have come out of this World War. As I say, we're not really going to go into the politics or anything like that. We want to look at something a little different, a different side of it. Now, one of the first stories, now Penny's a wealth of information. She sends me lots of stuff. Absolutely fascinating. Now,
which one do you want to start with?
We're going to start talking about the beastie one.
The Beasts of No Man's Land.
The Beasts of No Man's Land. Now, I actually have an opinion on this. I actually have a theory.
Oh, so do I.
Yeah. So, right, can you tell me a little bit about this, please? Because I'd never heard of this before.
Okay. Well, I had, funnily enough.
Really strange.
It's strange, isn't it, that I'd heard of this? I didn't know as much detail as I subsequently looked up for your show, but I had heard of it. Now, what what it's meant to have been is that if you look factually, if you look at the factual thing first, if you were shot, now everyone probably knows what no man's land is, and the Germans used to call it Niemandsland, and no man's land was the gap between the trenches where nobody owned it. So you had the sort of the German and their allies trench on one side, and the British and their allies trench on the other side. Now, that gap could have been as big as 4 miles. That gap could also have been as small as 200 meters. So the gap was very different, and it's the one that you see the films, which I have to be honest, now been a lot of them are recreations rather than live footage. But you see the men coming over the top and running across the barbed wire while the machine guns are going. There's mortars going off. That's no man's land. Now, you can imagine if an order, and there's a reason I'm saying this, if there was an order to charge, i.e. the whistle had gone and you had to go over the top, whichever side you were on, if you were shot down, the chances are if someone was running next to you, they couldn't stop. They had to keep going, because if they stopped to try to help you, they were dead too. Yeah. So at the end of a battle, at the end of when they've gone over the top, there would have been a lot of dead men in the no man's land who would have fallen in sort of foxholes and were just mown down by machine guns or mortars or whatever the horrific methods of killing were. But there would have also been men who were dying who couldn't be retrieved because it was just too dangerous to retrieve them. But there was also deserters. There were people who just vanished. And the penalty for deserting, for going AWOL during World War I, was to be shot. I always find that ironic.
Yeah,
The reason they've gone AWOL normally is because they had shell shock, which was only really started to become diagnosed as a psychological disease towards the end of World War I. Anyway, it was a doctor up in Scotland who actually said, no, this is a mental health problem, and that later became PTSD. Yeah. But a lot of these men who deserted, there was mental health reasons for why they deserted. But as far as they were concerned, mental health didn't exist, if you know what I mean, and you would be court-martialed for desertion and shot. So if you were going to desert, you did it so nobody found you. Personally, I don't think a lot of them did desert. I think they probably were killed and never found. But that's just my personal view, based on history and based on what happens now, 100 years later, with bodies still being recovered that nobody knows who they are and they haven't got dog tags or any insignia on what they're wearing or anything. But the whole point about these the wild soldiers, the beasts of no man's land, is that the soldiers would be going to sleep at night when the guns would fall silent. Because guns didn't go 24/7, not far off, but there'd be times when there was moments. They said they'd hear dogs howling. They would hear guns going off in no man's land where there shouldn't have been any. They would hear groans and the sounds of like rabid men, sort of thing, going off, and that made them believe that there was these wild men who had deserted from all sides.
Yeah, that's one thing I noticed. It was all sides.
All sides had deserted from all sides and had gone underground, had gone into the tunnels and would come up at dark when the guns they weren't shooting at each other, basically, to ravage from the men who were dead and dying. And they also believed they would eat them, they would steal from them. If any of them had their rations on them, those would get taken. And that was a very strongly held belief by all soldiers, not just one side. It was actually mentioned in the 1920 memoir of Arden Arthur Hume Bierman, who wrote a book called The Squadroon, which you can actually look at on the internet. You can look at an electronic copy for free on the internet. It's quite difficult to read because it is written in quite old style, almost, 1920s language. But Arden Arthur Hume Bierman was actually related to S.G. Hume, who was the one who supposedly found those recent Jack the Ripper diaries, and was the puppeteer and the children's author. They are related. Now, in his book, he talks about these wild soldiers and wild deserters feeding on the corpses, making sort of inhuman sounds. And that was really what gave it, if you like, wings, so that people did start talking about these wild men of the trenches.
I have to say, on this one, when I first read about this, I was like, okay, well, no man's land obviously is a terrifying place. You're going to have to go over it, you're going to have to cross it at some point. The chances are you're going to not live through that. It's got that fear factor in there straight away. If you got injured, you were left, like you said,
Sometimes. So if you can fit sometimes you were, yeah.
So if you manage to survive to an evening, there's going to be wild animals coming out and maybe making the most of
scavenging.
Thank you for that word. And if you are able to try and maybe save yourself and get out of that situation and not go back to fighting, then you maybe would. I can understand there'll be a band of deserters, whether or not they were doing the horrific acts that have been outlined, but maybe they were actually going out to try and help people that were left in no man's land, rather than the cannibalism and stories of those. That's what I was thinking when I was reading about it.
Yeah,
I maybe it was more to do like that than anything else.
Possibly. I find it very hard to believe that some of these men, I don't find it hard to believe that they would have become mad. That I don't find hard to believe, because when you read true accounts of what they were going through every minute of every day, I think I'm amazed how many of them came home sane, if I'm completely honest with you. And I don't mean that in a facetious way or a ha 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 way. I'm genuine. I was reading a book called The Soldier's War earlier today, actually, by one of the best sort of history authors out there, Richard Van Emden. And it's all private accounts from soldiers. And some of them were, I'll read you out a few of them later, because they really are. It does make you wonder how these men, and the women who are working on the front lines in the hospitals and everything else, how they stayed sane. It blows my mind. I don't know how they did it, but I just wonder if any of these deserters, I mean, wouldn't they have wanted to get as far away from those guns as possible? I actually think the noises these men heard were the dying, because people make very strange noises when they're in pain and when they're dying and when they don't know where the hell they are. And when you look at some of the injuries these men were suffering, they were suffering blown off limb. Without being, I don't mean to shock anyone, but they were suffering blown off limbs. They were suffering severed torsos from the machine gun fire. You have to think that World War One was the pioneer of plastic facial reconstruction surgery. And so you can imagine things that they were going through. It always makes me think and you'll probably go, who? There was a song by Metallica called One, and it's about a soldier who has had he's lost his arms and he's become a quadruple I can't remember what it's called. When you lose a limb, he's lost all 4 of his limbs, but he's also lost his face as well. So he's basically being kept alive with a straw into what remains of his mouth. And in the video, he's saying to them, just kill me. How can I tell you I want to die? I've got nothing left. Why are you keeping me alive? And I can imagine those grunting noises that he makes in the video to try and make himself understood, because he physically can't get the sound out. Probably would sound inhuman and would sound like a rabid animal. You also have to remember that's how wet it was out there. Yeah. I mean, you've probably seen the photos of the mud. If you fell in one of those foxholes, like the craters, they filled with water, you drowned. Yeah. You drowned in the mud. And who makes a normal noise if they're drowning? And if you physically can't get yourself out because you've been injured. So I do wonder if the noises they heard were men, but they weren't wild men, they were dying men. Yeah. That's my theory. The animals, animals survive. Wild animals do survive. And there were a lot of, not wild animals, that's the wrong way of putting it, but, dogs that homes had been bombed out, so they would have just been trying to survive as best. There's loads of accounts of them rescuing puppies and having stray dogs suddenly appear and make themselves at home in the trenches and stuff. Yeah. Well, they had to be fed. There's the story of the rats that they had in the trenches that were huge. And in fact, I was reading one of the accounts in this book, The Soldier's War, which is apt. This guy was a medic, and he said this soldier came, paraphrasing what was said here, but he said the soldier came into him holding a bandage against his ear, which looked like it had been bitten. Had a chunk bitten out of it. And he was like, what happened to you? And he was basically, his wife had sent him some nice smelling cologne, and he'd forgotten to use it. So, because his hair smelled, he put it on his hair, and he went to sleep, and he woke up to find a rat biting his ear off. Oh, gosh. Now, if a rat could do that to a sleeping man who's breathing, what could a rat do to someone in it? And rats do eat human flesh. So
they eat anything, I think.
They eat, well, yeah. So that's what makes me wonder if it was, there may be a ring of truth to it. There may be men who've gone wild and went cannibal and, literally became animals, but nobody's discovered them. And somebody would have discovered them subsequently. So my theory, saying that these were wild men that they had nothing they could do with, helped subconsciously the guilt that there were dying men out there that they couldn't help. That's my theory. I might be wrong.
Quite possibly. I think it's one or the other, in all honesty. But whatever it must have been, it just adds another element of horror to the situation. I think that's whatever way it is. I just think it adds another horror to level of horror. I mean, gosh, like you haven't got enough going on. You then have to listen to that of the night, and we all know night brings its own different fears in, doesn't it?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's one of those that it's whichever way. All I can say is, if you ever get a chance, read Arden Arthur Hugh Beeman's book, The Squadron, because it's got a lot of information there, and it's kind of semi-autobiographical, but it's got a lot of information about he served.
I would imagine it's very sobering reading as well.
Yeah, it's not, in all truth, it's not one to read when you're not feeling great about life, because it'll bring you even further down. But if someone who's interested in first-hand accounts, it's one of the ones that I would pick up and have a go at reading, if you're interested in first-hand accounts.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go on to something a little bit more hopeful, shall we say?
Okay.
If you can look at it this way. Let's talk about the Angels of the Mon. Angels of Mons? Yeah.
Well, obviously I wrote a blog about that last month.
Yeah.
That's on the website. And that this was an interesting one, because it's one I'd heard of for years. I'd heard of it, the Angels of Mons. Basically, the Battle of Mons was a very, very big battle very early on in the war. In fact, it was I think it was the 22nd and 23rd of August, 1914. So it was literally less than a month after the war had actually started for the British, because the British started going out there on about the 4th of August. So it was one of the first big battles. And if I give you some figures, which will give you an idea, there was around 4,000, or so it's believed, but like with everything, you can't get exact figures for these things, around 4,000 British and Allied soldiers. They were facing nearly 21,000 Germans.
That's bad odds.
Sorry?
That's not good odds.
That's not good odds, no. So a retreat, after 2 days of fighting, a retreat was ordered. Now, anyone who studies military history will probably know that a retreat is actually more dangerous sometimes than carrying on fighting, because you've got to try and go backwards whilst looking where you're going and looking behind you at the same time. This retreat was ordered, and to put it in a nutshell, it wasn't going very well. And the Germans were encircling the allies, for want of a better term. Supposedly back in the UK, and this happened for one of the other legends we're going to talk about, people were told to pray for the British soldiers so they could get out of there. And according to the reports, suddenly loads of angels were seen. Massive white figures as angels in the guise of medieval archers. And supposedly, and I say supposedly, I'm going to quantify that, they started holding the Germans at bay so the British could get out. Now, I say supposedly because it was first looked at in April 1915 in Spiritualist magazine. This account of what happened at sort of, 6, 7, well, actually more than 6 months, was that 8 months after the event of what had happened. But as people have reviewed it, interestingly enough, there was a story called The Bowman by a fantasy writer called Arthur Machen that was published in the 29th of September 1914. And it was called The Bowman, and it was talking about these angel bowmen of Agincourt. Now, it bears a very, very strong resemblance to the myth of the Angels of Mons. And it's such a strong coincidence in that even our friends at the SPR back in 1915 started examining it to find out if they could find any eyewitness proof of these angels being seen and supposedly German soldiers with arrow wounds on the battlefield. Now, the SPR a very, very long time investigating it. I'm not sure the exact figures, but they spent a long time trying to get accounts. And even now, and I trawled through the internet when I wrote the blog on this, I cannot find any first-hand accounts. They're all second or third hand, like somebody told me this, or I heard this from this person's uncle, or there's no name associated with it to have been able to trace back. So, well, they wouldn't be alive now, but back when they did the investigation, there is no person who's put their hand up in an account and said, I was there, I saw it. And that was the legend, the Angels and Mons. Now, whether it was because of this story by Arthur Mack and the Bowman, and it was elevated into being, it was one of those. Funny enough, I was talking to Aaron Sagers about this the other day. That people, something will be made up in fiction, and people want it so much to be true that they say it so many times it becomes true. Do you get what I mean? It's a false truth. And I wonder if the angels, these medieval archers, are one of a case of that.
Possibly. I mean, at the time, during World War One, there was a Brigadier General John Charteris who was incredibly good at spreading false propaganda, shall we say.
Yes.
Now, it wouldn't shock me if things like this were being deliberately put out there to give people hope that, you know, we are the righteous, you know, the angels, even the angels are on our side, kind of scenario. And we're going to talk about Brigadier General John Charteris a little bit more in the next segment.
The soldier, the next, that's
in the next segment. But it wouldn't surprise me if this was an encouraged tale, if you know what I mean, by the propaganda machine that goes on when you have war. And it works both ways, doesn't it? You know, the propaganda machine works both ways. However, I think in a time where there is so much loss, people do cling on to these kind of stories, don't they? That, you know,
definitely.
And if you are believing you're on the right, it gives you that we are on the righteous side. We are doing the right thing by sending our men out there to die. You know what I mean? To fight for our country in, you know, that's not on land that's not even ours. You know, for allies. And it gives that inner righteousness of what your actions are the right actions. So whether or not, it would have been very, very interesting to have found first-hand accounts, wouldn't it, of this? I mean, some of the information I found was very detailed, actually.
It is,
on this one. You know, like the story is very quite detailed. In the story itself is incredibly detailed, and it's interesting. That in itself is interesting. So if that's a major embellishment, as people have told the story and then told the story and then told the story, which we know happens, you know, it's a bit like the fishing story. I caught a small fish, but by the time you get home, it was like a 20-footer. You know? It's a little bit like
it's Moby Dick.
Yeah, that's it. You know, like it took me hours to pull it in. It was like a goldfish.
A sprat. Yeah.
You know, so whether or not this story is a pure example of that, I don't know. But it would be very interesting. But I would also like to state that people under that amount of pressure, which you would be under those circumstances, the pressure on you as a person would have been immense. And that's not just one person, that's everybody, both sides.
And mass hysteria. And I mean, anyone who's been to a gig, and just before, you know, big gig, and just before the band comes on, you feel this wave of hysteria. I've done it. I'm not that. I know I'm quite bubbly and I'm quite energetic when I'm excited about stuff. I don't tend to get hysterical though. No. And I've been to the odd gigs where, especially when I was younger, that as the crowd just welled just before the band came out, I am screaming and crying along with them. Oh, and I'm almost thinking to myself, I haven't been to a band like that for a long time, but I know when I used to go to gigs, you know, pre-kids and all of that stuff, I occasionally would feel like that, and I'd be doing it going, what the hell am I doing? This isn't me. And I'm still doing it because I can't help myself. Yeah. So, and that's in a positive situation. Yeah. In something that your life is at risk and your adrenaline must be going through the roof.
Yeah, and don't forget, they're also like on rations, so they're not having
sleep deprived.
Exactly, you're not having like 3 square meals and having you know proper, you know, you're not properly hydrated. You're physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted. There's so mentally you're exhausted. You're exhausted on every level. And then you've got this situation. And then, so maybe it was a mass hallucination as well. Having said that, we heard accounts of the same thing from the German side, who were actually in a very positive situation of they were going, yeah, we're going to beat them, we're going to rout the British at this point. So who knows what happened here? But I have to say, I think, talking about Brigadier General Charteris, I have to say, I think he was an incredibly, amazingly good propaganda machine. And it wouldn't surprise me if this basis of this story comes down to a time where the British public at home needed that hope, and the troops hearing the story filter back through in different areas were like, yes, we've got the angels on our side.
But also, sorry, if you look at the historical side, this story started to come out just when people were being asked to volunteer to go.
Yeah.
And the whole Kitchener, your country needs you thing started.
Yeah.
So, produce something like this. So any, women will say to their brothers, their husbands, their sons, you go, God is on our side. God is protecting us. So,
and you also have to remember, religion back then was a lot more... a staple of people's lives, a lot more than it is today.
Yeah.
So that would have been a factor.
Yeah. And I do want to say this, right? If anyone is listening who thinks I'm deriding religion or whatever, I'm not. I am looking at both sides of the argument, because if you believe there were angels or there are angels and they came to help the British, I'm happy for you. I'm looking at both sides.
Yeah.
I would love it to be that's what it was.
Yeah,
because that would be absolutely amazing. And the other legend that we're going to talk about in a bit, I would love that to have been, because not only does it prove there are higher beings who are... But then my argument is, why that particular case? Why step in there? What was... And I'd want to know why, if they had stepped in there. Yes, all right, 4,000 men could... But they wouldn't all have... Some of them would have been taken prisoner. Some of them would have got away. It's a fascinating story, and it's one that I don't think we will never know unless someone's written an account of it and it's got hidden in their loft space and it gets found in 20 years when someone's doing a loft conversion, or do you know what I mean? I would love it to find that first-hand account by someone who is proved was in that battle, who served there, who saw it firsthand. Yeah. And I mean, we know the SPR, they're pretty vigilant when they're researching something, and they found nothing. So, or they found nothing that was documented and published.
Yeah.
Who knows? Who knows? It could be that there are records on it in sort of GHQ, the intelligence, British intelligence, and they're just like, we cannot release this. We can't release this. This is too big. We don't know. But it's an amazing story, and it is the thought of seeing like sort of 10-foot angels with arrows is quite. And like you say, that when you think of their health, you think of the state they were in. They were sleep deprived, they were dehydrated, they were stressed, their lives were at risk. A lot of them were young men away from home for the first time. Whatever they could cling on to keep going, they would have done.
Give them something. Better than giving them nothing. Yeah?
Yeah.
We'll go with that one.
Yeah.
Right. Now, the next one we're going to talk about is actually quite horrific.
The gruesome one. Okay, yes.
And this is a story about corpse factories.
Oh, you want to do that one, not the other gruesome one? Okay.
No, I want to talk about the corpse factories, if that's possible.
Yeah.
I actually have to say, this particular story, I think it shows an impact it would have had on World War II as well.
Uh-huh. I was surprised it was a World War I story and not a World War II one, if I'm completely honest.
Well, when I read it, I was like, oh, okay, now I can understand some things in a different perspective from World War II, of why people weren't quite so believing of the death camps, because they'd lived through this, and it had been found out to be a propaganda story. So,
yes.
So anyway, tell me about the corpse factories.
Well, the belief in the corpse factories is that the Germans, or the Huns, Hun as they were known, were taking dead bodies and basically, how do I put this, packaging them up to then, in effect, and I generally don't know the science of how they did it, but melt them down for the glycerin to make into soap.
Yeah, and glue.
So basically and glue, but use the body fat and everything to make into soap and various other substances that glycerin was used for.
Which, to be fair, is still a thing that happens now. They use bones from cattle and horses and stuff like that.
Yep.
So it's not unfeasible, everybody.
It's not unfeasible, no. Scientifically, no, it's not unfeasible at all.
So you can understand why it was used in, why it was put out there in the way it was put out there. But it really is an against the Germans scenario here on this.
It's very much anti-German. It was the Germans that were meant to do it. In fact, the translation for it, and I can't actually speak German, but it's something like Kadaververwundung Sansoltult, something like that, which meant carcass utilization factory.
Yeah.
So there were even cartoons about it, and supposedly in 1915, Cynthia Asquith, as in Prime Minister Asquith, related that sort of connection, was discussing it because she wrote it in her diary, and and it was in the American press in 1915 and 1916. The French took it up in February of 1916. There were cartoons drawn about it, and moaning that they hadn't got enough pounds of glycerin out of a body because it didn't have enough fat on it, and all of that kind of thing. And and people believed it. People believed it because you didn't have the means that we have now to sort of double check this story. You didn't have the internet, you didn't have social media, you didn't have telephones really to phone your friend in sort of Germany and say, is it true you guys use human bodies? It wouldn't have been. It was even raised in the House of Commons.
Yeah, it was. Because
they were so shocked about it. But it was, and Charteris was involved in that one as well.
Well, he later admitted that this was not a true story, that this was a propaganda story that he had basically created. And he'd actually forwarded the article, he'd heard this rumour, seen basically a picture. One was a train taking dead horses, which they were using for this reason. And then another one which had dead soldiers on it. And he'd had the pictures transposed, basically. So it made it look like it was the bodies that were being used in this way, not the horses.
Yeah.
Okay. And he used that as a piece of propaganda. Now, he actually sent the article and planted it in the newspapers to create this propaganda against the Germans. Now, bearing in mind, this was happening quite late in the war, wasn't it? That was...
about 1917, I think that sort of bit started. It really culminated in that side. It was being talked about early on, almost from the start, but it was around 1917 that Charteris manufactured this evidence.
So you've got to remember that by now the war has gone on 3 years. People are probably going, come on, we're not winning this war. People are dying. Too many people are dying. Our men are dying. And the whole political landscape was probably turning, public opinion was probably turning against the war. They were starting to see horrific injuries coming back and men being mutilated and not being able to work. You can imagine it was quite a volatile situation in regards to the popularity of continuing this war. So then to have something like this go into the newspapers, it creates new outrage. It creates a new, we've got to beat these people kind of scenario, doesn't it? It's absolutely horrific. But as I say, Brigadier General John Charteris admitted that he planted this story, that it was no basis in fact whatsoever.
Yeah. I would like to hasten to add the stories that started did say it wasn't just the Allied bodies that Germans were using. It was their own men as well.
It was any dead person, basically.
It was any dead person. Yeah. So, and I know that doesn't make it right, but it makes it sound less like it was against. It was to try and, there were other stories that were planted about the Germans, that they ate their children, that They didn't have the correct body parts, that, anything to make them seem like monsters.
Exactly.
And this was just one of the most extreme ways of like making Germans seem like they were monsters. And to be fair, propaganda, it didn't stop in World War II. I've seen copies of some of the World War II propaganda leaflets, and they're just as ridiculous when you look at them now. But people believed it because they were being conditioned to believe it.
Well, there was no information, like you say. There was no other real information coming through, so you can only believe what you read in the newspapers. These days, we have a lot more access to a lot of different things that we can form a different opinion on news stories. Whereas those days, they only had newspapers and radio shows, basically. And if that's what's being put out in the air, you believed it. You know, that's the simple fact. Now, one thing that actually horrified me about that, it occurred to me that after the event of the World War, these propaganda stories began to show their face for what they were. And, it was being reported that this was just a propaganda story. It wasn't true. So it kind of made me see that in World War II, I always wondered why there wasn't more outrage about the so-called death camps that the Nazis were doing. And I couldn't ever understand why there wasn't more action taken against that. And now I've learned this. I'm wondering if people were just seeing it as another propaganda against the Germans, whether people were becoming more aware that this is part of war. That's what people were being fed to make you hate the Germans and, the people you're fighting against. And whether that's one of the reasons why people were a little cynical about the truth of the death camps.
And the fact that a lot of people in the UK had seen Jewish influxes into the country before, and it hadn't always been good. It's that whole "they took our jobs" kind of mentality. So, this influx of the Jewish population coming in the 1930s before the war started, but obviously after Hitler had started his march at that point and started his sort of clearing campaign. They probably didn't believe them when they said that they were being rounded up and put into ghettos. It would have been like, yeah, okay, whatever. And I'll be honest, we get that now. Yeah. Who believes some? I know some of the immigrants who come over, but that happens now. Who believes some of them when they tell them about what they've experienced when they were at Serbia or Bosnia or parts of Africa? Or you look at it and you go, nah, that can't be true. Surely not. So it's always happened, and I think it always will. I think that's the people who were abroad when these camps. I think the people who lived in the towns where these camps were, they were probably too terrified to do anything about it. Well, they were too terrified.
There is that factor too, isn't there, when you've got your family's lives at stake?
Exactly.
It's amazing what you can turn a blind eye to, and I think it shows human nature.
Yep, and it's amazing.
Your family that's at risk. You don't put that at risk, unfortunately. You look after your own.
Exactly. But there's also, you've got that indoctrination. You've got that when you look at people, and I'm not saying I admire Hitler in any way, shape or form.
No.
But he was an orator. You watch like things like the Nuremberg Rally, and you can see it's that mass hysteria again. But somehow it was perpetuated when he wasn't there talking to them. Yeah. And I guess some people did go along with it in fear of their own lives and their families' lives and everything else, which they were well justified in doing when you read the reports of what would have happened if they hadn't. But I do think some of it was a kind of, I mean, there were even reports from inmates in these camps who genuinely believed they were going to a camp to be looked after.
Yeah.
And it was only once they got there they realised this ain't true.
No, but I think, again, the propaganda of, look, what will happen, we're going to take you to this place. We've seen those film footages and the adverts for that. You're going to be safe here. It's particularly for your kind of people.
It's a holiday camp.
It was put very much like a holiday camp scenario. And I suppose in that kind of environment, you think it's going to be safe for your family, and that's actually that's the only thing you want. So you're likely to believe it. And as I say, looking at this story of the corpse factories, I did wonder the impact it had on people's mentality going forward into World War II. and whether or not that's why people were like, nah, that's not really happening. Those corpse
Yeah, could
factories
have
didn't
been.
happen, so these death
Could have
camps
been.
ain't happening. I don't know. It was just a thought that occurred to me, and it made me wonder if Charterists actually had a huge negative impact on the belief systems of people going through into World War II because of the false propaganda he was spreading in World War One. It was
Could have
just a
done.
thought.
It's good. I've not thought of it like that, mate. That's very, very good. I've never thought of it like that. I'm honest. I've never thought. It's one of the reasons I love talking about this stuff with people is the different views, the different perspectives, the different. That's. I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
I don't like it, if you know what I mean. But
No, I understand what you mean.
I like the suggestion. I've not thought of it like that because there is the other big propaganda that he spread that was quite horrific as well.
Go for it.
The crucifixion.
Yes.
He supposedly back in August 1914, a soldier was, I can't remember, it was an English soldier, British soldier, supposedly was found crucified to the side of a barn with German bayonets. He was one of the original British Expeditionary Force, the BAF, who were the first ones out there before it became conscription and everything else. And supposedly he was found by a Canadian, I think it was Captain R.A. Allen of the 5th Canadian Battalion, who identified that these were German bayonets that had crucified this man to the side of a barn. And then supposedly they found other crucified soldiers in a similar way. Yeah.
But there's that religious thing there, isn't there? That's that horrific. I mean, at the time, we go back to the religious mentality at the time. You know, the Jesus dying on the cross. It was all very horrific. He died for our sins, and these men are dying for our sins in the trenches and in this war. You know, and it's very evocative of mental imagery.
Yes, and I think it was also, I mean, then the story changed that it was actually Canadians who'd been crucified, not the British. And and there's supposed to be accounts that there was some British, Canadian soldiers, and the Times reported this, who'd been fighting in Ypres, or Wipers, as it was known to the British. And they'd arrived at a base hospital in Versailles, and they told how one of their officers had been crucified by Germans. And that started leading to the belief that the Germans crucified men rather than just killed them. And yes, it's that whole religious thing, but it's not just the religious iconography of it. It's the fact that it's almost ridiculing people who believe in religion, because they it could be seen either way. It could be seen that the person being crucified was resembling Jesus, as in he was being crucified to solve everyone else's sins. But conversely, it could have been that the Germans were doing it because they were heathens and they were monsters, and they would want to ridicule any of your beliefs anyway. So, of course, they crucify someone perfectly innocent who... again, that one could be seen either way. But what was interesting is it transpires. The reports were... The story was never verified by anything official. And it was actually transpired it was another one of Charterists, and he wrote how the story originated. And they actually now believe that it was part of his black propaganda campaign, which included the Angels and Mon, which included the Corpse Factory, and something we're not talking about, but people could go and look up if they wanted to, the Belgian civilian atrocities. And this was all part of Charteris's campaign to make people see the Germans as monsters and heathens and subhuman and everything else.
And you can now understand why, going into the World War II, there was that hatred for the Germans. These are the same generation of people that, you've grown up with, the people going into World War II had grown up with their families that had come out of World War I and had this absolute hatred for the German people. And it was propaganda like this that did that. You know? And even now, the older generations still have this hatred. And we even see that translating through into sport. and I'm not trivialising it at all, but when you look at when Germany plays England in football, it is a thing. It is, we will beat the Germans again, you know what
Yes.
I mean? It's almost it's so deep set, this thing about the Germans, and this is all born out of this time in World War One, and this black propaganda that was done around this time, and showing you some of the stories, the folklore and the mythology that came out of World War One in regards to the supernatural, as it were. These were all stories that have been generated and brought up, and through this propaganda and they used every level of subconscious to get it into people's heads that this is the right thing, the war, and we are the righteous people to do that, and the Germans are monsters and horrible and should be fought against.
But it's even taught like that in history now, in this country. And I have had arguments with, not so much about World War One, but about World War Two, with German contacts of mine who've said things that we supposedly did in World War Two. And it's like, well, that's not how it was written in our history books. That's not how the flight plans said it happened. That's not how the reports said it happened that were filed with the MOD. Yeah. But that's what they were believed.
But I think it goes both ways. I think there's probably propaganda on both sides. We're just looking at it from a British perspective tonight, really.
We are. I mean, one of my favourite things when I can get hold of them is to look at official reports. Obviously, I'm a historian. I'm a nerd. I get off on that kind of thing. And I will look up these things. Sadly, with some of them that are this old, it's quite hard to get the reports because a lot of them aren't digitised. And as much as I would love to go and sit in the record archives office in Kew Gardens, I can't. But looking at official reports, fine, reading around the stories, because I think my favourite one, being a horsey person, is the last one that happened in April 1918.
Tell me about that.
The White Cavalry.
Yeah.
Now, most people have heard of the Angels of Mons, but not many people have heard of the White Cavalry, although it's incredibly similar to Mons.
It's really close, and a lot of people get the two muddled up, don't they? They think it's the same thing.
No, it's not, because one happened almost at the beginning of the war, and the other one happened, if you like, towards the end of the war. And basically with this one, again, there was, they were outnumbered. They were, it was very near Arras. I'm never sure how to pronounce it. And the British were trapped. The Allied forces were completely and utterly trapped. There was supposed to have been Portuguese soldiers with the British as well. Now, what was interesting is there's a Captain Whitewick who's mentioned in a lot of the accounts. And as me being me, I decided to see if he was real or just a myth. And I did find his birth and death records. So it looks like he was a real person. Captain Cecil Whitewick Hayward. And he was born in April 1876, I believe, in Bradford, and died in after World War II, actually. He died in May of 1949. But he's meant to have written the account of what happened. So where the Angel of Mons was supposedly summoned by the British people to help our boys out on the front, these battles near this place called Bethune were raging on. They were the loss was we were getting pounded by the German forces, and supposedly the call to prayer went back, but it also went across the Atlantic as well to America. And the feeling is that the prayers were answered, because as this intense artillery was firing at the Bethune lines, so the Allied forces, all of a sudden they suddenly noticed, this Captain Whitewick suddenly noticed that the forces, the Germans, started firing in the opposite direction into nothing, and really, they're absolutely blitzing the ground, and they couldn't figure out what was going on, because it wasn't like the methodical Germans to be firing into thin air. Next thing they supposedly this went on for a while, and all of a sudden he sent a couple of his men to go and check out what was happening. And subsequently, his men came back with all these German prisoners, like hundreds of them, who'd waved a white flag and given up. And they were throwing down their weapons and running towards the British lines. And when he actually managed to speak to some of these German officers who could speak English, and he was asking them what had actually happened, they were like, well, didn't you see them? Didn't you see the cavalry? And he's like, what cavalry? And they said they were white cavalry wearing white uniforms on white horses, and they were charging at us. And no matter how much we shot at them, they didn't stop. But the British didn't see them.
Something definitely put the fear of God up the Germans that day.
Something put the fear of God up the Germans. And the British didn't see them. They questioned quite a lot of the back prisoners, who all told the same story, that this was this ethereal white cavalry appearing out of the smoke. And no matter how much they shot at them, not one of them fell.
Is
and
this
that
one verified? Do we actually have accounts of this one, or is this just another story?
Well, it's because I say I have found proof that this Captain Whitewick existed, and he's the one who's meant to have made the reports. I have not seen any further research on it, which surprises me, but he did exist, whereas the officer whose name escapes me, who's meant to have made the reports for the Angels and Mon, no one can find hide nor hair of his details that he existed. And for the life of me, I can't remember the name of him. I think it's in my blog, but I can't remember right now. It's been a long week. But
it has been a very long week.
But Captain Whitewick Hayward definitely existed, and he was in the intelligence corps. So was it the fact he was in the intelligence corps, he had the links to Charteris, and Charteris told him to write a fake account? Or did it really happen? Did the Germans really think they saw a white cavalry? Because there was no white cavalry. All white cavalry. There probably were greys on the cavalry, but there was no cavalry that wore all white, all had blonde hair, and carried swords and nothing else. Mm-hmm. So who knows?
Who knows? Who knows indeed. Well, on that note, we are actually coming to the end of the show. We hope.
Oh.
I know. We could go on. We haven't even touched on personal accounts.
No.
And there are many we found personal accounts of people with ghostly experiences. Maybe we should do another show on that another time, Penny.
I think so.
Before we go, I'm just going to play this. Good night, everybody.